Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Family Research Council. My name is Bethany DeMin, and I'm the Student Interns and Lectures Coordinator here. My first day on the job here at FRC was last June 25th, and I will always remember that because the next day was the day that the Supreme Court legally redefined marriage. Even though this was a monumental day in our nation's history, looking back now, legal marriage for same-sex couples has been almost completely obscured by the transgender movement. Between Bruce Jenner's very public transition to a new identity as a woman named Caitlyn and the current administration's treatment of the American military as a social experiment, transgenderism and all of its demands for accommodation have created a whole new front in the fight to preserve the truth about humanity. For those who believe gender matters, the new tolerance has a message. Conformity is the only acceptable response. Our special guest will discuss this and the broader implications of propaganda and what she refers to as political conditioning during what is sure to be a very interesting talk. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our guest. Just want to welcome you if you're joining us via webcast. We're glad you're with us. And as always, our lectures will be posted to our website and YouTube later today, and you can feel free to share that with your various social media friends and acquaintances. Now to introduce our speaker. Stella Morabito is a senior contributor at The Federalist. Her essays have also appeared in The Washington Examiner, American Thinker, Public Discourse, Human Life Review, and New Oxford Review. In her previous work as an intelligence analyst, she focused on various aspects of Russian and Soviet politics, including communist media and propaganda. She has raised 3 children, served as a public school substitute teacher, and homeschooled for several years as well. She has a BA in journalism and international relations from the University of Southern California and a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history, also from USC. Would you join me in welcoming our speaker?
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you all for being here. So I'm just going to get right into the meat of my talk and ask if you've ever noticed, or if you haven't noticed, or in case you haven't noticed, the culture today is totally saturated with a push to mainstream what we call transgenderism, or the transgender movement. Now, the Bruce to Caitlyn Jenner transition was just a piece of that, but obviously it was a big one because it had quite an impact on the public. But there's also a constant flood of television shows like Transparent and a flow of interviews, whether it be transgender teenagers or models or so-called pregnant men or all this kind of stuff going on prime time. And the train has been moved along by celebrities like Oprah Winfrey and Diane Sawyers and Barbara Walters and Katie Couric and all of them. But obviously, the intent of this total immersion, and it really is a total immersion, I don't know if you can feel the total saturation going on, is to desensitize everybody to it. And on top of that numbing effect, we're also seeing a lot of what we call jamming or suppressing any possibility of a dissenting point of view or any voice that just doesn't get with the program. So all of this is kind of a vehicle to institute conformity. And the red flag that I see here is that censorship, and increasingly government-sponsored censorship, is central to pushing the whole agenda through. But first, I want to add that when I saw the title given to this talk, Bruce or Caitlyn, another title occurred to me, another question, and with a rhyme in it, and that's Jenner or Penner. Now, I don't know how many here know the story of Mike Penner, but he was a Los Angeles Times sports writer who transitioned in 2007, changed his name to Christine Daniels, and started up a blog called Woman in Progress. He became a major spokesman or spokesperson anyway for the transgender transgender movement, transgender activism. But then, after about a year or so, with absolutely no explanation, Penner decided to detransition. He readopted his byline, Mike Penner, and from the Los Angeles Times website, mysteriously, all of those blog entries by Christine Daniels had been scrubbed. So Penner discussed none of that, but obviously he had major regrets. Regrets that apparently couldn't talk about to anybody, especially the transgender community, which is very deeply invested in silencing any word of regret. And you will see this over and over and over again if anybody who regrets transitioning speaks a word publicly. Now, the tragedy in all of this is that in November 2009, Mike Penner killed himself. His funeral was kept strictly private to keep out media. The transgender community had their own memorial service, but only for Christine Daniels, not Mike Penner. So as far as the transgender project is concerned, Mike Penner, in a sense, never really existed. Once he detransitioned, he became a non-person. And I think Penner's silence, which really is deafening in all of this, and it speaks volumes. So we should all care about the transgender movement because the silence that it is imposing has a very far reach. It's certainly a gag order for regretters, but through the censorship laws that it pushes under the guise of anti-discrimination, but these are all censorship laws, it also gags each and every citizen, including those who support the agenda, because at stake is the very freedom to express what you believe about what it means to be human, and your freedom to change your mind either way about what your beliefs are and what you might express. And this is happening in every area of society. It's happening in medicine through Obamacare, in K-12 education through Common Core, in the military, on college campuses, big time, corporate employers, just everywhere. So in this talk, I'm going to go beyond the damage that transgenderism does to individuals. I mean, I think we all can see that, even if the movement itself doesn't acknowledge that. But it's huge. It's a road that leads to a staggering rate of attempted suicide at 41%, which is well over 20 times the general population. And I can go off on a tangent here and talk about, what dysphoria really means. Dysphoria means depression. I mean, people kill themselves because they're depressed. But when you're, anyway, this is a one-way street when we're dealing with the issue of suicide. It has a record of the transgender movement when you're dealing with the issue of suicide, whether it's by someone who regrets the decision or may be, a poster child for the movement. There is zero tolerance for those who regret their decisions. That's not discussed. It's just kind of swept under the rug as a total minority. But that's a topic probably for another day. But I'll say that one point, case in point, is Walt Heyer, who dares to speak out. He lived as a woman for nearly a decade, as you may know. Walt keeps a blog to help other people who struggle with regret. I mean, the struggles are just unimaginable. It's called sexchangeregret.com. And the sad piece is that not only is Walt's voice a target for silencing constantly by the transgender lobby, but he has tried 6, 7, 8 times to get his birth certificate changed back to indicate that he is male and not female. And he has been denied each time. This is totally a one-way street and a very lonely one at that. So conformity is a big piece of this whole picture. But mostly today, I want to step back and look at the big picture of the transgender movement and how it's having the effect of truly dismantling freedom, all in the name of freedom, and for building the power of the state at the same time. Obviously, this isn't a really easy thing to unpack, but I'm going to try because I think it's really urgent. The threat to anybody's freedom, everybody's freedom of expression is coming at us fast and furious through that channel. I think that vehicle of the transgender movement is really kind of like a silver bullet that is pushing that forward. So I have 4 kind of elements that I've identified to illustrate how the transgender movement serves as a vehicle for increasing and consolidating the power of the state. First, I would say it comes to us, and I'm going to talk about each one of these, but it comes to us in the guise of individual freedom. But it's such an extreme form of individualism that it's self-destructive of individual freedom in the end, and I'll explain that later. But extreme individualism is one element. The other element of it is that it sows chaos into the language. The laws that are coming at us require us all universally and without exception to accept the seismic change in the definition or the undefinition of what it means to be human and what relationships mean. Thirdly, and this is really important and speaks to what Bethany mentioned in the intro, it requires a very aggressive program of censorship in order to sustain itself. Very aggressive. And the fourth element is that it depends very heavily on an aggressive campaign of agitation and propaganda in order to condition people to get with that program. So let me start with the first, extreme individualism. Extreme individualism has always been a Trojan horse for statism. It sounds kind of contradictory there, but it really isn't. And I'll get into that a little more. The transgender movement presents itself, as I said, as a matter of individual freedom and authenticity of self, which are both positive ideas in Western culture. But the individualism that we're dealing with in the transgender project is so extreme that if enforced legally, it would sow chaos. Now, we can all try to imagine a world in which over 7 billion individuals are free to pursue their authenticity, in whatever way they wish, whether they feel that they are male or female or neither or both. I mean, all of these are on the gender spectrum, and there are many, many more, as many as there are people, as we've heard. So, and another item is multiplicities of people. You can insist on being referred to as the pronoun they. So these are all really choices on the gender spectrum. And we can kind of try to imagine a world like that, but it's a totally different story when the law demands that all of these identities be enforced by law. Obviously, that's unsustainable. So it really serves mostly to just create chaos that creates a vacuum in the end for state power to come in. And to understand how this happens, I think we need to try to better understand the struggle, as I was talking about before, between the individual and the state. A lot of libertarians, and especially progressives, seem to see this dichotomy as only individuals versus the state. And they tend to overlook the relationships and the associations that serve as what I call buffer zones, these mediating institutions that actually have served over time, especially in our system, to protect individuals from state encroachment. And of course, these institutions are the family, church, private associations of various kinds. And I'm going to commend to you a fantastic book, a classic by the sociologist Robert Nisbet. I don't know how many of you know his book. It's called The Quest for Community. And it was heavily influenced by Alexis de Tocqueville. And here's just one excerpt from it, or one passage, which I think really rings true. Individual versus state is as false an antithesis today as it ever was. The state grows on what it gives to the individual as it does on what it takes from competing social relationships, whether it be family, labor unions, profession, local community, and church. And as the individual cannot but find a kind of vicarious strength in what is granted in the state. So in summary, the state actually grows by giving to individuals while taking from their autonomous relationships, the relationships that they freely have, whether in family or church or other institutions. And that whole dynamic was perfectly illustrated in the Obama campaign's infographic a few years ago called The Life of Julia. She was basically an atomized, isolated individual. At least that's how it's portrayed in the infographic. And but from cradle to grave, the state was her main relationship. So those competing relationships, the social relationships, are really what allow autonomous communities, free communities, to rise and to flourish. And I like to call them buffer zones because they do stand between the individual and the state, and they protect the individual from state power. And they give a free society the balance that's needed to maintain freedom and to prevent state encroachment in our private lives. Now, the transgender movement, again, on the surface, might look like a libertarian or progressive promotion of individual freedom, but it doesn't allow for any real balance of power in society because by its very nature and its language, it ends up turning over to the state control of all of those buffer zones, all of those mediating institutions, as it creeps into education, medicine, the family, military. It's just every aspect of life. And when individualism is so extreme that it undercuts these institutions, the individual really does stand naked before the state without those alternative relationships that supported him in the past and gave that measure of true autonomy. So, ironically, when that much power is given to the state, you end up with a state that can really regulate all social interactions at whim, and including those of transgender individuals who may have started out as a protected class, protection that's easily taken away, though, once the mediating institutions are gone and all power ends up when the state kind of goes into that vacuum. So it basically changes the very nature of human relationships, starting right at the core by disrupting the organic relationships inside the family itself, and then broadcasting those disruptions throughout society and all of those different elements of society. A lot of people who are just kind of going with it now, going with the flow, can't foresee the extent of the chaos that's going to be sown and how humanly impossible it would ever be to keep up with it legally. So in this case, one's self-definition as, one's gender identity ends up trumping all of the natural relationships of that person in society. And I see it as fallout from the broken sense of community. And this book I can't recommend highly enough, The Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet. And it all has its roots in that really extreme form of individualism that came with the sexual revolution. So gender identity seems like the last frontier, but it really isn't. A lot of people think, well, this and then it's, it's all over. But I'm going to digress just a tiny bit and say that I believe that transgenderism is really the bridge to something called transhumanism, and I don't know if you've read about that, but that's a continuation of man's ancient quest for immortality. But obviously that's for another day. But my point is that individualism, that extreme, is at odds with freedom. It ends up in the same place. It ends up in control of the state. Okay, I'm going to move a little more quickly, but my second point that I made had to do with the language. And the very definition of gender identity amounts to basically a war on language, which is a war on communication, free speech, free communication, just conversation, really, when it's that extreme. It ends up on a war on privacy and, in the end, those personal relationships. And it does that by changing the common and clear language by which we've always been able to understand our own humanity. It sows a lot of ambiguity into the language. I mean, the spectrum of, Facebook said 50, others say like there's just no end to it, as many as there are people of gender identity. And it permeates every segment of society. I'll read you just a couple definitions. One of them comes from ENDA, which was called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which has been trumped now by something called the Equality Act. But that definition says that gender identity means, maybe you've all read this stuff before, but the gender-related identity, appearance, or mannerisms or other gender-related characteristics of an individual with or without regard to the individual's, and this is key, designated sex at birth. Designated. And another definition is one's internal personal sense of being a man or a woman. For transgender people, their birth-assigned sex. Again, that's really key in what we're talking about. Birth-assigned sex, or sex assigned at birth. You'll hear that phrase over and over again. So the claim is that their birth-assigned sex and their own internal sense of gender identity don't match. Well, if you think about that for just a moment, that changes the language of everybody's identity, because the laws that are being imposed are all based on the premise, really, when you say sex assigned at birth, that nobody's sex is real. In essence, it really separates our sex from our bodies. I mean, if you go down that road, you see how it does that by declaring that we only have gender, and that's the most important thing, and that gender only exists in our minds. So, where do we go with this? It's extreme because it muddies and then destroys a common language, especially the human understanding of biological sex distinctions that have always allowed us to live in autonomous families and free communities unmolested by the state. And of course, these gender identity non-discrimination laws that have already been passed in a lot of states are based on that premise and language that everybody's sex, that's kind of under the radar, but you'll see that phrase assigned at birth in there. It's a huge premise with vast implications for society. It applies universally. I can't say that often enough. And if codified into law for everybody, it codifies into law for everybody that transgender understanding of gender identity that has to override everybody's biological sex distinctions, legally override that. And it keeps expanding. I mean, according to the American Psychological Association, it means a person's self-perception, gender identity as male, female, or something else. So codifying self-perceptions as protected traits requires that the rule of law give way to as many different interpretations of perceptions as there are people perceiving and people being perceived. And they breed a lot of mental fog and require us to do away with any common acceptance of reality. So we should care especially because erasing our sex distinctions in law, which is what this really amounts to, as they apply in nature to childbearing and child-rearing, threatens family autonomy. I mean, there's just no way around this. It's as though a new legal definition of human as neither male nor female would apply to you whether you like it or not. And we're already seeing government documents that have erased the terms mother and father, and there's a lot of social pressure for everybody to comply with the notion that biological facts are mere like social constructs or what gets dismissed all the time as the gender binary. So, but what that does is it obliterates the template. I'm going to say that again. It obliterates the template for the biological family existing as a legal unit. Because if the family is no longer accepted as the union that originates, or a unit that originates through the union of male and female, then there's no real basis, this is where we're heading, for the state to recognize by default any biological family as an autonomous unit. And there's a lot of stuff out there, I think, to corroborate this, including Martha Feynman's project at Emory University, where she talks about having caregiving units replace the family and how marriage actually should be abolished as an institution. So that's really where we're heading. Actually, Lawrence Tribe is going down that road too, saying that all marriage should be abolished or not state recognized. So anyway, after that digression, I'll just say without that obligation, though, of understanding, when the state isn't obligated to understand children as being connected to their biological parents, as it's just kind of like the template. Obviously, we have adoption, we have a lot of other, families, but as the template, then children more easily become classified as state property or get commodified. So, and our personal relationships end up getting more controlled by the state. So, and just to drive this home, I think we need to understand how the transgender movement dictates everybody's gender identity as fill in the blank, because it proposes to do so from birth. This assigned at birth phrase is really something that you can't dismiss. Last year, Slate published an article calling for an end to infant gender assignment, by which it meant that doctors and parents should stop identifying newborns as either boys or girls. And this is the path we're going down. And it claims to do away with limits on our identity or gender identity, but it creates a vacuum. It creates a lot of ambiguity, especially for young children who crave and need structure and specificity. Even when they're clueless about sex, they need answers. They've got natural curiosity. I mean, if you understand child development, you know that mixed messages like, oh, you figure it out. You decide what you are, or what reality is. These kind of mixed messages, as a child is trying to discover the world around him or her, doesn't open up possibilities for children as much as it closes them off and closes them down by sowing confusion. So I'm going to move on to my third point, which has to do with how we're seeing. No, I'm not. I'm actually going to add to this last point about language and how it contributes to an assault on privacy through something that's been proposed called Leela's Law. And that's just kind of waiting in the wings. But what it is, it happened after a highly publicized suicide of a transgender youth in Ohio last year. That was the pretext for proposing this as a federal law would essentially do away with something that it calls conversion therapy, which is basically, I'm sure that there could be extreme forms, but there are medical malpractice laws that deal with extreme forms. But the law that it proposed would actually give the state greater control over what counselors are allowed to say about a child's gender identity in the therapist's office. And it also applies to, you could say, what is said in homes and in churches. So it claims to ban conversion therapy, which basically means counseling that wouldn't be in compliance with the transgender movement's idea of what gender identity is, but ends up giving the government carte blanche to interpret and dictate and define what exactly conversion therapy means. Again, we're dealing with a one-way street here. It empowers the state to arbitrarily punish any counselor or parent or clergy reported to have supported such counseling. And, the state is there to define that. And it's basically a one-way street in terms of banning conversion. It would appear to ban any kind of not conversion, but counseling, cognitive counseling for people who regret having transitioned, and especially people like Mike Penner, whose suicide doesn't matter at all in this scheme of things. So it's kind of, as it metastasizes, a codified law like that would really place a chilling effect nationally on cognitive therapy and has huge implications for privacy in the church, in families, in schools, and especially in the therapist's office. It has Big Brother sitting right there with the therapist, dictating what questions might either the patient, I suppose, could ask some questions, but it dictates exactly how the counselor must must respond to each question in those cases. And of course, we've also got the military issue. Last year, President Obama wrote transgender equality into the national security strategy, and it was 5 years before we had a last national security strategy. That was 2010, but then 2015, he included it. And of course, that has the effect of incorporating it into the military, sowing a lot of chaos there, as well as exporting the transgender project globally. So now my third point had to do with censorship. And censorship and thought policing just are natural pieces of the transgender law. They just come with the territory. It's an inherent part. And I think that's obviously because it's a war on the laws of nature, basically a war on reality. And when you have a war on reality, you really do have to determine what people can or can't say to try to prop up that anti-reality. So it always has been on a direct collision course with freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. Obviously, it comes to us in the name of anti-discrimination, while at the same time requiring everybody to reject sex distinctions as a part of human nature and replace it with gender identity. And there's no way around that. To accept transgenderism is to accept thought policing, because it forces everyone to stifle their thoughts about what our existence means in physical reality, what being male means, what being female means, if anything. So under the pretext of protecting a transgender individual's sense of inner reality, we have to reject any commonly held outer reality that, we can talk to people about. And therein lies the difference between gender identity anti-discrimination laws and various other anti-discrimination laws. You're dealing with extreme individualism that requires a great deal of censorship to prop up an anti-reality. And when people are not free to express what they believe on pain of punishment, it basically shuts down personal relationships and turns us into a more closed and uncivil society. As we heard before, the floodgates open on the heels of the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage. And it's amazing how these floodgates for censorship laws, disguised as sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination laws, which has the acronym SOGI laws, but they're basically censorship laws. And they're the sort of laws that can result in a $250,000 fine in New York if you misgender a transgender person, and they can also shut down your business and your bank accounts if you politely recuse yourself from applying your artistic talents, whether those talents have to do with photography or flower arranging or, designing a cake, to the celebration of a wedding that you can't in conscience support. That relationship is deliberately broken, your relationship with your conscience and your moral code. It's really like gangster government is what we're dealing with. There's the latest attempt to restore some semblance of freedom of expression is South Dakota's House bill that's recently titled An Act to Ensure Government Non-Discrimination in Matters of Religious Beliefs and Moral Convictions. And that basically, the fact that we've come to that basically illustrates that the LGBT agenda puts us directly on a collision course with freedom of conscience. And never mind all those reassurances that you might have heard from legislators in the past, like Governor Cuomo, who said, we're just going to get some strong conscience protections in place before we pass this bill. It was in New York back in, I think it was 2011. That's gone. I mean, that's just, that mask is off now. So, and the South Dakota bill just basically states that people have a right to express what they believe. If they believe in organic marriage, I call organic marriage natural marriage, or their belief in abstinence till marriage, or that human beings are biologically male and female. It allows people to retain that sense of conscience without being basically burned at the stake financially and otherwise. So, and of course, I guess it's the HRC, the LGBT gay lobby, or a transgender lobby, just has a very take no prisoners approach to any kind of a law like this. I mean, any kind of even whisper of free expression. And that should be proof enough that this agenda is inextricable from state-sponsored censorship. That's what it is. And it's on a direct collision course with the First Amendment because it demands that universal acceptance of language that pertains to human identity, despite the language being at odds with physical reality. And we can look at Canada to understand what's coming down the pike. We've got laws there that, 10 years ago, they legalized same-sex marriage, and immediately all these tribunals, hate tribunals, I guess they call them, were set up in every level of government to basically surveil individuals and businesses for compliance. And there's a Canadian, Don Stefanowitz, has written about this in public discourse. Basically, how immediately after that happened, the term natural parent was erased from law, and mother and father is no longer permitted, and children only have legal parents, and as defined by the state. So anyway, I won't go into that, but Don has written a brilliant piece in public discourse about that, Stefanowitz, which is, I think it's up to 500,000 social media shares now. And we also see this permeation of censorship happening in what you might consider bastions of conservatism, as well as in churches, evangelical churches. There's a very active program to marginalize any conservative who doesn't get with the program, something called the American Unity PAC, the name Paul Singer. The idea is to get all Republicans on board, get all Republicans, quote, on the right side of history. And Paul Singer's that, billionaire hedge fund manager. You are not going to find on that American Unity Fund website any mention at all, even though it's sponsored by Republicans. They talk about free enterprise and all that, but you will find nothing about freedom of conscience there. If you find it, let me know. I'd really like to see. And of course, the ultimate goal is to pass this Equality Act, which explicitly prohibits freedom of conscience protection. It refers back to the 1993 RFRA. In Congress that says that has no bearing on this. So the unity that they're talking about is a coercive unity, which is not unity at all, but enforced conformity. And then in the churches, lots of things are going on there, to kind of turn things around and get them on board with the transgender as well, the whole LGBT thing, but particularly transgender issue. Is at odds with freedom of conscience, because it basically demands that the Christian reject the theology that exists in the scriptures. So, and then faith-based partnerships with government is really facilitating this. When the federal government can give a church program millions of dollars, it's pretty clear that in this administration there would be LGBT strings attached to that. So that's happening. And I've only got a couple more minutes, but I just want to say a few things about how marketing and propaganda played a huge role in getting us to this place, and also are an inherent part of the whole movement, and play a role in dissenting and silencing views. Obviously, the T in LGBT was hiding in plain sight for decades. People were taken by surprise, I guess, over the past year or so when all this transgender stuff started happening, but it was a big part of the package. People just didn't pay attention. The seeds of public compliance probably started with the manifesto in '89 that was put together called After the Ball. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it was a manifesto-style book written by two men, Marshall Kirk, Hunter Madsen, that called for a very, very heavy media campaign and propaganda to push forward the LGBT agenda. And they called for a three-pronged strategy that we're seeing, or we should have seen over the past several decades. Desensitization was a big part of it, and we see that now with the saturation of the media. Jamming was the second part of it, and that just means suppressing, again, censorship as an inherent part of the whole program, any voice of dissent, and then, of course, followed by wholesale conversion. And there's a whole lot more that you can read about in terms of how collective belief formation comes about and teasing public opinion cascades, especially if you've got Hollywood and the media to, do all of your messaging and everything, and every other voice is suppressed. So people end up with the illusion that an implausible idea is becoming dominant in public opinion simply by not hearing any other voices or any voice of questioning it. So there's a lot of social psychology behind that. It's easy to want to rely on reason and logic as a means of persuasion, but that really only works in a civil society. And we're, for those who haven't noticed, we are moving out of a civil society. And the transgender lobby, instead of relying on that, relies on very aggressive methods of agitprop and marketing that have actually coaxed out what I believe are conditioned emotional reflexes. And you'll see this especially on college campuses in people. And this happens especially when people are susceptible to social pressure to conform. And, I think there's a lot of reasons about it that you can read about in the quest for community, a lot of reasons this has happened. I mean, people have lost their moorings. Extreme individualism of the sort we see in transgenderism, I believe, comes about through a sense of loss of community. And, of course, a loss of collective memory and connection. Obviously, family breakdown through the divorce culture and sexual revolution causes community breakdown. That's basically family breakdown you could look at as the midwife of community breakdown. So all of those factors add up to a deep sense of alienation and I think loneliness in society that draws people more into individualism, extreme individualism, of which transgenderism is the most extreme expression thus far. So there's this sense of separation and atomization with fewer strong relationships. So people end up looking more and more, and we see this on college campuses, for connection. And they look for connection through the collective, or socialism, or whatever you want to call it. But these are utopian schemes. They want something that, the Julia kind of existence, but basically means ceding all of our individual freedom to the state. And I guess we're on a collision course with reality. And I really am past time. I'm just going to read a quote from the dissident feminist Camille Paglia, who said, how transgender phenomena multiply and spread, this is kind of bleak, in late phases of culture as religious, political, and family traditions weaken and civilizations begin to decline. So, it's a fascinating quote, and it all goes back to that sense of separation that people are feeling. Ultimately, the great irony in my mind is that this whole agenda is ultimately not about gay rights or transgender rights. I do understand the emotional pull of those arguments for people, arguments about equality, but with censorship such an integral part of the agenda, it ends up really becoming a campaign against human rights, against human freedom of conscience and dignity, because the follow-up to censorship is always centralized power in the state. And that never ends up in a happy place when there's state power, because it tends to feed on itself. That's centralized. We see that pattern throughout history. Whoever the victim class is, whether workers or peasants, whatever, they tend to come with a vanguard that centralizes power, and we never have a happy ending there. So it stunts our growth. The centralization of power that comes from that extreme censorship stunts our growth as individuals, actually, because it causes people to become more polarized and fearful about sharing their perspectives. And that ends up being maybe a good, perfect for a surveillance state or a centralized state, but it's very tragic for true human friendship and for real sacrificial love. And those are my thoughts for today. And if anybody has any questions, I will try to unpack those as I try to unpack this. Austin, yes.
Austin Roos, CFAM and Breitbart. A comment that you can respond to. I put something up at Breitbart the other day about the medical schools now spending a fairly large amount of their time in training future doctors into the transgender ideology. Have you seen this?
No, I haven't seen that, but it doesn't surprise me one bit.
It's phenomenal. I'll send you the link at Breitbart. But it is now a major part, including at Catholic medical schools like Georgetown, that are running these scenarios where they're going to train not just the doctors, but also the receptionists and others not to assume somebody's gender, or somebody's whatever. Yeah, it's it's phenomenal. What's going
It
on?
muddies the water for all human relationships. It's and of course a huge invasion of freedom of conscience. Huge.
Yeah, I just wonder if they'll be doing, have cadavers of all the 57 genders. Just
more than that, right? 7 billion, right?
Well, but that sort of gets to the point, which is that this this tension between biological reality. I mean, Christianity is, based on male, female. It's a Genesis 2. It never changes. This is sort of the fundamental rock of sort of human beings, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that this is going to change, that this conflict is going to go away, I think is wishful thinking, and it just sets up for non-ending conflict between these two, between this ideology and sort of the foundation of the civilization. But the problem is, is there anybody out there who's saying, if you can't define the gender, your gender malleability, and this is, I guess what I'm saying is this is a completely non-falsifiable theory. There's no science here. What's the science of this? If you can't tell me that it's 2 or 12 or 27, I've got 2. I've got XX and XY in every cell in a person's body,
right,
except for extremely rare cases, right? What do you got?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, no. Well, we can use reason and logic in a civil society. We could talk about science, real science, in a civil society. But this movement is purely political. It's a vehicle. That's how I see it. It's an effect of extreme individualism, how it affects individuals who feel disconnected, and we become more and more, and transhumanism is, right on the edge here too. That, hasn't even, there's a lot that hasn't even been explored there by the general public. But you're talking about, language, really. Why can't we just say, who we are biologically and how, that we have, a number of chromosomes, X or Y, and it doesn't play now that we aren't living really, I don't believe, in a civil society anymore. What we have is a power struggle going on. And it's an ancient power struggle. It's the divide and conquer kind of thing going on. That logic and reason don't really penetrate in the population anymore. This is all social media kind of internet age population. It's all emotional reflexes that we're dealing with. And it's really, again, it's hard to unpack, but that is, people are being conditioned through the agitprop and prevented to hear any other views through, the censorship and the smearing of anybody who has another point of view. And it really, it cuts us off from all relationships. I don't think people really understand that without boundaries, it's a paradox of our existence, really, that without boundaries in language, without boundaries that we recognize in reality, we can't really have a common language. We can't really share a common reality. And if we can't share a common language or understanding of what it means to be human, or exchange our ideas on that even, then we can't have relationships. We can't have personal relationships without those boundaries. So it's paradoxical, because you've got, we have this urge for individual freedom, but that has to be balanced and tempered by sacrificial love, really, where we give of ourselves in families and communities and other associations that serve as that buffer zone that protect us from the encroachment of central power, state power. But it's as old as human history to be dealing with this kind of stuff. So, yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for the interesting talk. So I guess my question is, what do you think is the true motive for people? Like you mentioned, the two people who, like, one wants to abolish marriage and one wants to, like, establish, like, caregiving communities instead of family. I mean, surely these people see the benefits. I mean, they know that people are happy with, marriage and families. What do you think their true motive is to sort of, push for, like, the destruction of institutions that are so obviously, like, good for society? Do you think it's just purely political, like, or do you think there's, like, a true, like, they really think it's honestly, like a good thing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think the true motive is there?
Yeah, again, that's another thing to unpack, motives. Obviously, I think there are always elites who are interested in this kind of thing. I mean, there's always going to be power elites, but they're a tiny, tiny minority. However, they have a strong interest, and, if they're well-funded, they can push certain agendas along that they think will, increase their sense of power. But, people like Martha Feynman, if you read her book, I think it's called The Autonomy Myth, or The Myth of Autonomy, where she basically talks about, and this was over 10 years ago that she wrote this, that all legal marriage should be abolished. And we're seeing more of this now through something called the civil rights movement, where, hey, we have same-sex marriage, but what about us if we don't have partners? That's not fair. Marriage, civil marriage, state-recognized marriage is not fair. And Cass Sunstein has written about that as well. And now Lawrence Tribe is going down that path. It's not fair to singles. So what that does is atomize us. It tears apart any state recognition of the family as a unit. Sure, you can write up these private contracts, and the state might enforce what it is you say about, your marriage to each other. But the state doesn't recognize it as a marriage. And therefore, it sees you as like two parties to a contract where you're an individual, naked individual in the eyes of the state, which means that, has huge implications for all relationships. I mean, think about what would happen if that happened to spousal immunity. I mean, in all 50 states now, nobody can be required to testify against their husband or wife or spouse in a court of law. But if marriage, civil marriage, state-recognized marriage is abolished, or as libertarians like to say, get the state out of the marriage business, that basically allows the state right in to treat you just as an isolated individual and with no regard at all for your familial relationships. But there's a utopian strain in people. I understand that. I mean, wouldn't it be great if everybody, my son says, I hate, whenever people say, wouldn't it be great if everybody, I just run, it's like, I run the other way. Because it's basically a collective idea. It's an idea that everybody get with the program. It's total conformity. And you can't have a society. You can't have compelling personal relationships. You can't develop personal relationships. Nobody, I don't care what your orientation is or whatever, can develop strong personal relationships in that kind of a closed society. I mean, but that's where we're headed. In the name of these kind of utopian ideas, like Martha Feynman says, she's a gendered legal theorist, and she's well connected with the Obama administration. She says that families, when we do away with private marriage, or then we can examine more what goes on inside the household. It's kind of like we can avoid domestic abuse. Okay, so that's one point. But the other thing she says is, and this was an incredible line to me, I wish I could remember it, but she talks about in her book, The Autonomy Myth, will be better able to monitor all social interactions. That's where we're headed. I mean that's the idea, and perhaps a true believer in what is good and right, and we can set up a society where, according to their vision, everybody is well taken care of. We wouldn't have, people, if they pass whatever test the state gives them, have families that, can keep their kids. But for the most part, we're talking about caregiving units where, the family is kind of defined as what, people who are dependent being taken care of by people who can take care of them, like whether they are children or elderly or disabled. That's what she means by caregiving units. Just, kind of throw them all in the same pot and, forget the idea of family. So anyway, I don't know that answers your question. They're true believers. There are utopians. A lot of this is utopianism. And there are power mongers. I mean, study a little history. There are power mongers, yeah.
We'll just do one more question. Hi. What recourse or hope do we have to fight this or turn this around?
Okay, yeah, I didn't really go there. It's kind of bleak, right? Well, what we're dealing with is a war on personal relationships, in my view, all personal relationships. And that start with the family and then get broadcast out into community and all of society, because that's what censorship is. When you cut off people's, ability to communicate with one another. The only way you can handle censorship is to understand that free speech is a use it or lose it proposition, and you have to speak even in the face of censorship like this. That spiral of silence dictates public opinion. That dictates public policy. I mean, you can develop public opinion in, I'm sure Kim Jong-un in North Korea has a 99% approval rating, right? I mean, he starves and kills his people, but he has a 99% approval rating, I'm sure. And that's caused out of fear. And the fear comes from that fear of that sense that you have to conform or, out of a matter of survival. And if you don't want to end up being the tank man who stands in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, the time is kind of running out. And I believe, since the outlets, Hollywood, media, academia, are all pretty much controlled by these political forces, the war has to be really fought one-on-one. We have to be willing to speak to people who like us and trust us and identify with us in our own sphere of influence in our daily lives. I'm not sure how you grow a movement like that, but it creates a ripple effect that Václav Havel talks about in his book, The Power of the Powerless. I don't know if you're familiar with that essay. It's fantastic. He's the late president of the Czech Republic, and he was a playwright, dissident under the Soviet era. And he wrote a piece about living in a closed society called The Power of the Powerless, and how it is really only through that private sphere, and make no mistake, the private sphere is the big prize. I mean, those who want to destroy it have the media, have Hollywood, they have everything else. The big prize is your personal relationships and your personal one-on-one conversations. And it really takes a ripple effect to get people to a point that they understand that their own personal freedom, I don't care where they're coming from, their own personal freedom to have real relationships is at stake. And because loneliness, I think, is what pulls so much of this extreme individualism, to the point where we are now, I think that kind of message resonates because it's a very lonely world. I mean, look at North Korea. I mean, that's the end result, the extreme, but the end result, what you get. I mean, I've studied totalitarian systems. That's what you get with censorship. So it has to be, it's use it or lose it. Your free speech, your freedom of conscience. There's a lot to lose in terms of, they're making a very expensive, $250,000 fine. Of course, that's for malice, I guess. The assumption, there's a presumption of malice. And there can always be a presumption of malice when, a centralized power is calling the shots. But I think that's really where, and I give a little talk about pushing back against political correctness, where I talk about the ripple effect and how important one-on-one, it takes a lot of kind of, organizing, but the word has to get out that if you don't use it, maybe a bump sticker, free speech, use it or lose it. That's it. Yes.
My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is of a statement that in Muslim societies, anywhere, in most of the Muslim countries, this is considered mental sickness, deviation from normal human standard, transgender lifestyle. But here, as a journalist, I observed BDSM community. They are very friendly, very inclusive. Where do you think their inclusiveness and tolerance is coming from if they are really mentally sick people?
Well, I don't really get into the mental issue here. I think that we can all be very friendly people, if we live in our world and we express ourselves, however we want to express ourselves. The issue I have is the demand that those who have a sense, that demand that people reject their beliefs, that they publicly reject what they believe in. That's really what I was getting at in this talk. But I'm trying to get at the core of your question. Where do you think the friendliness of some people is coming from? I'm not really talking about the individuals.
There is a kind of conflict that these people are, I'm talking about Islamic concept, not about...
Oh, you're talking, about...
that it's a mental sickness. And if it's mental sickness, then how come those people are so friendly on individual or on group level? They should be really very avoid people, not to have any connection with other people because... they just don't like themselves or their environment. That's what kind of make them to adopt this lifestyle. And then I had long conversation with these people, with the transgender and BDSM community. They said it's all matter of politics and intolerance. Like if you go to Republican circles or religious circle, these people do not accept them. They just kind of push them away, and that make them more angry. And so basically they are blaming Republican or fundamentalist Christian that these are the people who push them into this kind of lifestyle by not treating them as human being. And if you see Obama's talk, for example, it would give you the same kind of impression that somehow people who are more religious, or little more religious than normal people, they kind of push these people away. And that make these people more angry and more lonely, and then they kind of dig themselves in that kind of lifestyle, or transgender lifestyle.
Okay, so
what I'm coming from is that, do you think it's a kind of fault on religious or Republican circle as well, who reject them outrightly to this kind of lifestyle?
That's a huge question. When you say reject outright, you say, when people feel personally offended or insulted or hurt, I think that I I think that a culture that doesn't respect the dignity of each and every human being is going to create a culture of alienation and loneliness. Now, do I think? Yeah, I think if somebody is offended, offensive and mean and pushes somebody away, yeah, I mean, that has an effect on people. I mean, it's happened to me. It happens to all of us for whatever reason at some point in our lives. I think, what you're dealing with, what you're asking about is something that affects people because it goes very, very deep into our own sense of identity. And I would guess in an Islamic country or other cultures that, this is totally alien to. And I know that there are some cultures where they have that third gender thing going on and, everything is fine. But what we're dealing with is what it sounds like to me, you're saying, is what we're dealing with on a grand scale, I think, is wounded dignity. And when people feel their dignity is wounded and they feel like social outcasts, yes, I mean, they're going to, at a certain point, a lot of resentment. There are different ways it can go, It can end up in suicide. It can end up in just checking out of all society. It can end up in, a lot of anger, which I think is what we're seeing now in the shutting down of all public discourse. But is there a fault? I think the fault, in my opinion, is not really, it's kind of like an ignorance that a lot of people just in general have of the human condition and what it means. I mean, the humanities are not studied anymore. They're kind of like shut out of colleges now in favor of social sciences. And the humanities are really based on stories that have to do with what it means to be human. And we really have moved away from that. That's one factor, I think. And the other factor is that people do. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who feel threatened, especially if they're not used to that. I mean, everybody has an experience where if somebody seems very, very different, they don't know what to make of it. So, but if they blame it all on Republicans or conservatives, I think a lot of that is just due to the politicizing and the propaganda. And, I think that also if you are convinced in your mind that there is no male or female, whether, just in your personal experience, and you want the world to accept that as as the reality, people do get, it's not something easily accepted, easily dealt with by 90% of the population, I guess. And I'm not just talking about transgender. I think anybody who's really, really different in some way. I mean, if you have a family member who's mentally ill, you deal with it there too and see what happens to them. And I don't mean, I'm just talking about like schizophrenia or something like that. But yes. Do you have a question, Zach?
Well, I was just going to ask, what is your solution for transgender people? What would you hope happens to them?
Oh, well, I just think, my hope for every human being is that they can live in strong relationships with others and not feel disconnected from community without having to go and have an inner reality that requires censorship on the part of all of society. But it's my hope for every human being. I mean, that people don't suffer from wounded dignity that leads to that kind of breakdown in relationships and, just life and create so much turmoil in life. So, everybody is a human being, in my opinion, made in the image of God. And it's not even my opinion. I mean, you know, since I believe it, it's what I know. I mean, that's what Carl Jung would say. What you believe is what you know. But you know, my hope for everybody, it's the same as my hope for everybody. Thank you. Good to see you. Thanks so much for letting me speak. And I